What I'm going to talk a little bit about is this debate that we've already heard about this afternoon that constantly comes up in discussions about culture and value, the debate between the intrinsic and instrumental aspects of culture. So the distinction first occurred in the 19th century. It arose from the aesthetic movement, and you're very familiar with the term. We've heard it this morning, art for art's sake. But what's it really getting at? I think it's summed up in this quotation, which is, art needs no justification. It needs serve no political, didactic, or other end. So the point that's being made here is that art should not be subsumed to political purposes. Now, it might choose to do so, but it should not be an agent of the state. And I don't think you find many people who would argue with that point. But what it's not saying is that you can't recognize, celebrate, and strengthen the role that culture plays in our society. On the contrary, it's not saying that. So here's an example, an editorial from the BMJ written in 2002. Things have moved on. The NHS budget has grown considerably, closer to 100 million now. So 0.5% of 100 billion, just to put that in context, is 500 million pounds, which is not far short of 50% of the amount that the Arts Council currently divests to cultural organisations. So we're talking 0.5% of the health budget. It would be a huge shift in terms of support for culture. But nothing like that has, in the, 12, 13 years since that was written, nothing like that, remotely like that, has appeared on the horizon. Why not? I think this quotation from the former chair of the Arts Council, Dame Liz Forgan, very respected commentator and journalist and thinker, giving evidence to the Culture, Media and Sport Committee last year is very instructive. She says, I think it's a good summing up of the issue that the arts feels itself caught up in when it comes to the intrinsic and instrumental debate. She says, I think you're selling the pass if you sell the arts as either this will do good for your economy or this will help your problems with mental health. Now, just to break that down a little bit, I think she's got a point about the economy side, and we often bundle up the so-called instrumental benefits of the arts as being socio-economic, so social and economic stuff. Robert Peston, on the economic side, in evidence to the Warwick Commissions last year, said, talking about the economic benefit of the arts is a category error. For all sorts of reasons, it's a blind alley, not a particularly productive line of discussion. It's useful information to know and to back up the case, but it shouldn't necessarily be the central point in making the case for the arts. But when we come to issues like mental health or some of the other social benefits that we've been hearing about this morning, then that is where I think our attention should be focusing. And this is where Liz Forgan says, it's an instrumental argument, it's true, but it's not enough. You find yourself left with no arguments when you try and defend innovative contemporary practice, for example. Now, that was Liz Forgan, former chair of the Arts Council, since in the last, when did Baz become chair? 2 years ago. Sir Peter Bazalgette we've heard a lot more about the holistic case for the arts coming from the Arts Council. And that breaks down into these 4 areas, okay? And I think I'm right in saying that health and well-being are wrapped up in the social. But the point here is not that these are 4 different things that the arts can do, but that the arts delivers holistically across these different agendas. So a fresh approach to looking at the overall benefits of the arts. And this is backed up by this study that was commissioned by the Arts Council, I think perhaps by Richard Russell, who's going to be speaking later on in this session. And Wolf Brown, eminent consultants, were asked to do a literature review and analyze what they called, or what were called, the second-order health, social, and economic benefits that arise, everything other than the second-order health, social, and economic benefits that arise from attendance and participation in the arts. In other words, they were asked to look at the intrinsic. They were told, forget the instrumental, focus on the intrinsic, and tell us what it is that goes to make up the intrinsic art experience. Can you please look at the studies that have been done, the numerous pieces of research that have been conducted over the years, and summarize it for us and tell us what it is, the essence of the intrinsic benefit of the arts. And this is what they came up with. They said it breaks down into these 6 themes. So there's one around flow here, or that sense of captivation, concentration, absorption. There's one around personal connection and empathy, a word that Baz certainly is very keen on. There's something around learning and thinking and challenge. And then there's the whole process of aesthetic growth and developing our creative sides. There's another connectedness one, but it's to do with social connectedness. And finally, the last point, well-being and fulfillment, these sorts of issues around our health and well-being. Now, let's turn quickly to the new Economics Foundation. We heard, I think, 2 of the speakers earlier today referenced this set of guidelines, the 5 ways to well-being, that are increasingly widely used in the health sector. There's certainly some skepticism about this as the way forward, but they're to my mind, they're well researched and evidenced, and they have a sort of internal coherence that makes them quite attractive. So these apply to life. These are the kinds of things we ought to be doing if we want to have well-being. And they are, as you can see, connect, be active, take notice of the world around you, which is actually more about, I think that's more about being in the moment, what you might call mindfulness. Keep learning, and give something back. So let's just counterpoint those 2 themes, the intrinsic on the left and the instrumental on the right. Because you can be sure that those well-being impacts are instrumental, there's no doubt about that. But just look at them. Is it just me, or are these the same thing? Is this flow and engagement and isn't this being in the moment? Isn't this taking notice of the world around us and the beautiful around us? And then this whole issue of all those different qualities there, they come up down to that one word of connect? And then learning, that's fairly clear. Can we put aesthetic growth under the same heading there of learning? Give something back, perhaps that's not quite encapsulated in the Wolf Brown themes, but certainly I'd say, and be active doesn't strongly come out, but again, we know that physical activity is strongly connected with art forms like dance and so on, and just getting out of the house is in a sense part of becoming active. And indeed, the word well-being appears here in the intrinsic. So my argument really today for you is that intrinsic and instrumental are one and the same. It's not a question of trying to encapsulate both and make room for both in our lives, that culture can deliver intrinsic and instrumental benefits, that they are one and the same. There's the evidence that says so, as long as we consider them under the domain of well-being. And this is interesting because increasingly government policy, whichever party happens to be in power, is being influenced by the concept of well-being. And as I said earlier, it's well known that there's a lot of debate about what is well-being, how do we define it, and so forth. But I think it's a very progressive thing for governments to put out there and to make a goal of policy. Famously, the state of Bhutan has made gross national happiness, GNH, its overarching goal, and therefore GNP, decisions about GNP, gross national product, have to be filtered through the prism of well-being before they're made. So it's not just, if a new road has to be put through, it's not just a cost-benefit of analysis of how much economic benefit this will have, but all sorts of other factors linked to well-being are taken into consideration first. That thinking is influencing governments around the world, and I think including our own. So well-being, whatever it may mean to you, is an increasingly important concept for us to hold on to, and I would argue that culture helpfully sits within the domain of well-being. At the same time, health thinking is shifting. We have an aging population, you know all this. There's increasing demand on health services, everybody knows there needs to be an increasing emphasis placed and investment made into prevention and health improvement. It's not easy because the structures are set up to respond to ill health. And it's very difficult to divert resources away from the front end into upstream services. But everybody knows it has to be done, that we have to tackle the causes of the causes if the health system isn't to collapse under the weight of demand and increasing cost. So we're seeing the beginnings of upstream thinking. Michael Marmot is at the forefront of this, talking about the social determinants of health, pointing, for example, to the 18-year gap in life expectancy between the richest and poorest in the London Borough of Westminster, which Jeremy Hunt, the Health Secretary, former Culture Secretary, says we should be ashamed of. But Marmot importantly points out, to act on the social determinants of health, you must get past the assumption that inequalities in health arise from inequalities in health care. That's not where the problem lies. The health gap didn't widen in the past 30 years in the US and the UK, which it did, for lack of indoor toilets, but because people, this is what he says, people were not able to live the lives that they value. Not able to live lives that they value. And that leads into all sorts of behaviors that we know then causes the health problems that then cause the financial crisis that we see with our own health services. So here's a different way of looking at well-being from the New Economics Foundation, which is the Gallup Wellbeing Index, which is international across many, many countries, and it's self-rated. They ask people how they rate their own well-being, and they use some proxy measures as well. And the first thing that people come up with when they're asked how they measure their own well-being is purpose, having interesting and meaningful activities, using their strengths and achieving goals. These come above social, financial, physical, and community measures. So interesting wealth, financial, is only in the middle there. And physical health is fourth. So my proposition to you is in the same way as it's become widely accepted over the last 20 years that we all, because of the weight of evidence that points towards this, that we all should try and eat 5 a day, That health message is pretty universally recognized, I'd say. Less well recognized, but increasingly so. We should all try and get a sporting habit for life, and we should all try and do 40 minutes exercise a day. And what price a creative habit for life for all. Thank you.